Homer Bancroft rode into Redemption Flats on a Tuesday in the spring of 1878 with $37 in his coat pocket, a horse named Cinder who had seen better decades, and a plan so simple it could not possibly go wrong. He would stay 1 week, sell the 2-quarter horses he was trailing behind him, collect what a man named Garland Fitch owed him from a cattle deal gone sideways, and be back on the road to Colorado before the next Sunday's church bells finished ringing. He had made this kind of plan before. He was good at making plans. He was considerably less good at keeping them. Redemption Flats sat in the southeastern corner of the New Mexico Territory at the base of a long, sloping mesa that threw purple shadow over the town each afternoon around 3 o'clock, giving the whole place a temporary, dreamlike quality that Homer did not notice on that first day, because he was too busy squinting at the sign above the livery stable and calculating whether $37 would stretch to cover grain, a room at the boarding house, and 1 decent meal per day for 7 days. He decided it would stretch if he did not order anything other than beans and cornbread for supper each night, which seemed like a reasonable sacrifice for a man on a schedule. The livery man was named Tomas Reyes, a broad-shouldered fellow of about 50 with a gray-streaked mustache and the careful, appraising eyes of someone who had seen every kind of drifter come through a territorial town and had learned to assign each type a probable length of stay with reasonable accuracy. He looked at Homer for about 4 seconds before saying, "3 horses for 1 man. You selling or running?" "Selling 2, Homer said, climbing down from Cinder with the particular stiffness of someone who had been in a saddle for the better part of 3 days. "The bay and the roan, the gray is mine." Tomas nodded slowly as though this confirmed something. "Fitch is your buyer." "You know Garland Fitch?" "Everybody in Redemption Flats knows Garland Fitch," Tomas said, and the way he said it, not with warmth, not with hostility, just with a kind of flattened resignation, told Homer something useful about the nature of his upcoming business negotiation. "He keeps an office above the Mercantile. Opens around 9 if he remembers to." Homer paid for 3 nights of board for the horses, reasoning that he would have his business done and be moving on before a 3rd night became necessary, and then he walked the length of the town's single main street to get his bearings. Redemption Flats was not large. There was the livery, the Mercantile, a saloon called the Spur and Wheel that smelled of sawdust and old whiskey even from the outside, a dry goods store, a barber's shop, a small adobe building that served as both the sheriff's office and the territorial court when the circuit judge came through, a church of simple whitewashed wood at the far end of the street, and on the eastern side between the dry goods and the church, a 2-story building with a painted wooden sign that read Mercer's boarding house and meals. Clean rooms, fair prices, breakfast at 7. Homer ate supper at a long table with 4 other men that first evening, a surveyor working for the railroad, a cattle buyer who barely looked up from his plate, a young man with a bandaged hand who said almost nothing, and a weathered Apache man named Delgado who spoke excellent English and was, as he explained without particular emphasis, passing through on his way to visit relatives near the Rio Grande. The food was excellent. Pork in a chili red sauce with fresh tortillas, and a pot of black coffee strong enough to take the chill off a February night in the mountains, which it was not, but Homer found himself drinking 3 cups anyway because it was that good. He paid his 4 days' board in advance, because the woman who managed the accounts, a compact, serious-eyed woman with dark hair pulled back from her face, who came to the table long enough to collect payment and refill the coffee pot, told him the rate was 75 cents a day, including the evening meal. He gave her $3. She gave him a receipt written in a very clean, precise hand, and he went upstairs to a room that contained a bed, a washstand, a small window that faced east and nothing else, and he slept for 10 straight hours. The morning came in through that east-facing window with considerable enthusiasm. The light hit him square in the face at around 6:30, and Homer lay there for a moment, listening to the sounds of the town waking up, a rooster somewhere, the distant percussion of a hammer already at work on something, the sound of water moving in a basin in the room next door, the particular creak of a floorboard on the stairs that he would come to know very well over the following weeks. He washed his face, put on his second cleanest shirt, ran his fingers through his hair in a gesture toward respectability, and went downstairs for breakfast at 7 o'clock. The dining room held the same long table from the night before, though the surveyor and the cattle buyer were already gone, and only Delgado and the young man with the bandaged hand remained, both of them working through plates of scrambled eggs and fried salt pork in companionable silence. Homer sat down at the end of the table nearest the kitchen door, poured himself coffee from the pot that had been left on the table, and was wrapping both hands around the mug in that way a man does when the morning is slightly cooler than he expected, when the kitchen door opened. Inez Mercer came through carrying a platter of biscuits in one hand and a small crock of butter in the other, and she said, without looking up because she was concentrating on not tipping the biscuits, "Good morning, help yourself. They just came out." She set the platter down, set the butter crock beside it, and then she looked up and found Homer Bancroft looking at her with an expression he was not aware he was wearing, which was the expression of a man who has just heard something very simple and very ordinary said in a voice that makes ordinary things feel like they matter a great deal. She was 24 years old, with dark eyes that were direct and unself-conscious, the kind of eyes that look at things rather than around them. Her hands were strong and slightly flour-dusted at the wrists. She wore a plain blue dress with a white collar and an apron that had a small burn mark near the pocket from some previous morning's cooking emergency. Her expression was polite and businesslike and faintly amused, because Homer had not yet said anything back to her, and she was waiting. "Good morning," Homer said belatedly. "Thank you. You're the horse seller," she said. It was not a question. "Homer Bancroft," he said. "Inez Mercer," she said, the way a person says their name when they own the building they are standing in and see no reason to make it complicated. "How do you take your eggs?" "However they come," he said, which was the kind of thing a man says when he is still slightly off balance from something he cannot quite identify. She went back into the kitchen, and Homer looked at his coffee cup, and Delgado, across the table, said nothing but pressed his lips together in the private way of a man who has noticed something and has chosen, with great wisdom, to keep it to himself. Inez brought scrambled eggs, and they were the best scrambled eggs Homer Bancroft had eaten in several years, and he sat at that table longer than he needed to. He told himself he was letting the food settle before going to find Garland Fitch's office. He told himself the coffee was too good to rush. He told himself a great many things that morning, none of which were the actual reason he remained at the table until Inez came back through to clear the dishes, and they exchanged a few more ordinary words about whether the weather had been dry, and whether the road north was in good condition, and whether he expected to conclude his business quickly. "A week," he told her. "I'll be out of your hair inside a week." She looked at him with those direct eyes and said, "You're not in my hair, Mr. Bancroft. You're paid up through Friday. Stay as long as your business requires." He went and found Garland Fitch's office. Garland Fitch was exactly the kind of man you expected when Tomas Reyes told you that everybody in town knew him and said it the way Tomas had said it. He was large and loud, and wore an expensive waistcoat, and had the particular confidence of a man who had spent enough time in a small place to mistake local prominence for general importance. He shook Homer's hand with both of his and told him to sit down, and then spent 20 minutes explaining why the timing was not ideal for purchasing the 2-quarter horses right now, given market conditions, and the season and some complicated dispute with his foreman that had left him temporarily short of pasture. Homer had encountered this type of conversation before. It was the kind that cost you money if you were not careful. "I also understand there's the matter of what you owe me from the Cimarron deal," Homer said, keeping his voice even. Fitch's expression shifted in a direction that confirmed everything. Now that is a conversation that requires some context. $80 is the context, Homer said. I fronted you $80 against the Cimarron sale, and the sale closed 7 months ago, and I have not seen the money. I've had some expenses, Fitch said. I'm sure you have, Homer said. I'll be here through the end of the week. I'd like to leave with what I'm owed and the price of those 2 horses. He left Fitch's office with a promise, which he rated at about 50 cents on the dollar of its actual value, and he walked back down the main street thinking about contingencies. The contingency he arrived at was that he might need to stay a few extra days past Friday if Fitch continued to stall, which would require paying for additional nights at Mercer's boarding house, which would require the $37 to stretch further than originally calculated. He found Delgado at the hitching rail outside the Spur and Wheel, examining a saddle with the critical attention of a man who is thinking about buying it or thinking about telling the seller why it is not worth what they are asking. The Apache man by the river told me Fitch is slow to pay, Delgado said, without looking up from the saddle. He borrowed timber money from the southern ranchers last year and took 8 months. That's useful to know, Homer said. Also, Delgado said, finally looking up, Mrs. Mercer makes very good biscuits. Homer looked at him. I am simply making conversation, Delgado said, and went back to examining the saddle. Over the following 2 days, Homer settled into a rhythm that he told himself was simply efficient management of a business situation. He rose with the sun, went downstairs for breakfast, exchanged a morning's worth of conversation with Inez, who was always moving, always carrying something, arranging something, directing the girl who helped her with the washing, managing the accounts, cooking, cleaning, doing approximately 7 things at once with the focused energy of someone who had been running things alone long enough that the running had become second nature. He would visit Fitch's office each morning and get another vague promise. He would spend the afternoon walking the town or talking with Tomas at the livery about the horses, and in the evenings he would come back to the boarding house for supper and find himself in conversation with Inez again, because she always joined the table for the last half of supper if there were no more dishes to attend to. By the end of the 3rd day, Homer had stopped counting how many days were left in his original plan. He had stopped counting on the 2nd morning, actually, when she had said good morning to him again in that same direct, ordinary voice, and handed him a plate of flapjacks, and told him that the buckwheat flour had come in on the supply wagon from Santa Fe, and she had been waiting 2 weeks for it, and was glad it had finally arrived, and he had found himself genuinely interested in her gladness about buckwheat flour, which was not the kind of thing he had ever previously found himself genuinely interested in. He was 31 years old, and he had been moving since he was 19, which was when his family's farm in Ohio had gone to the bank, and the family had scattered, his brother north to Michigan, his mother to a cousin's house in Indiana, and Homer west, because west was the direction that absorbed people who did not have anywhere specific to go. He had done cattle work, some freighting, 2 years helping a land surveyor in Kansas, a stretch of time in Colorado that he was not particularly proud of, and then the horse trading, which suited him because it required movement and judgment, and the ability to read a situation quickly, all of which he was good at. What he was not good at was stopping. He had a talent for arrival and a corresponding talent for departure, and the space in between had always felt provisional, like a campsite rather than a home. On the morning of the 4th day, Friday, which should have been his last morning, he came downstairs to find the dining room empty except for Inez, who was sitting at the far end of the table with a ledger open in front of her and a cup of tea at her elbow, and who looked up when he came in with an expression of mild surprise, as though she had forgotten for a moment that the house had other people in it. "You're up early," she said. "The window faces east," he said, which was an explanation he had given before. "I should get curtains made," she said, but in the tone of someone adding something to an already long list rather than someone who intends to do it soon. He poured his own coffee, which he had learned by now was kept on the back of the stove until 7, and he sat down not at his usual place at the end of the table but in the middle, which was closer to where she was sitting, though not close enough to intrude on the ledger work. "Bad news from Fitch," he said, because she was frowning slightly at a column of numbers. "Fitch has nothing to do with my books," she said. "This is the cost of a new water pump. The old one needs replacing and the price of iron goods has gone up significantly since last year." "How old is the current pump?" 11 years. "It was here when my father built the house." She did not look up, but something shifted slightly in her expression. "He died 4 years ago. The pump should have been replaced before that, but there was always something more pressing." "I'm sorry about your father," Homer said. "Thank you," she said, and she looked up then briefly, with that quality of directness that he had noticed on the first morning and continued to notice. "He was a good man who built a good thing. I am determined to keep it good." There was a silence that was not uncomfortable. The kitchen made small morning sounds. Somewhere outside, a horse was being walked past on the street. "Fitch is stalling me," Homer said, not because it was relevant to the pump or her father, but because he found he wanted to be honest with her. "I'll be here past Sunday, most likely." "Room's not spoken for," she said, going back to her ledger. 75 cents a day." "I know the rate," he said. She almost smiled. He was fairly certain of it. That morning he went to Fitch's office with considerably less patience than he had been bringing on previous visits, and he told Fitch plainly that he had a buyer coming through from Tucson at the end of the following week who would pay good money for both quarter horses, and that if Fitch did not want them, he would simply sell them to the Tucson buyer, and the debt from the Cimarron deal could be settled by a territorial judge, which would cost them both time, and the judge would take a fee. This was approximately 40% truthful, in that there was a buyer in Tucson who had expressed general interest in horses, though no specific plans had been made. But Fitch did not know the percentage, and the mention of a territorial judge had the intended effect. "Come back Monday morning," Fitch said. "I'll have figures for you." Homer walked back out into the spring sunshine, feeling the satisfaction of having moved a stuck thing. And then he walked past the mercantile and past the barber's shop and stopped at the dry goods store, where he bought a length of good blue-gray linen curtain fabric and asked the proprietress, a stout, cheerful woman named Mrs. Harrington, whether she could have it cut and hemmed to window size and finished by tomorrow afternoon. Mrs. Harrington looked at the fabric, looked at him, and said, "This for Inez's window." Homer opened his mouth. "The east bedroom window faces the street, and I've been telling her for a year to get curtains made," Mrs. Harrington continued, already cutting the fabric with the confident speed of a woman who knows exactly what she is doing. $1.50 for the cloth and the hemming. I'll have it done by 3 tomorrow." He walked back to the boarding house feeling slightly exposed, which was a feeling he was not accustomed to. He had always been a man who kept his own business clothes, not from secrecy, but simply from the self-sufficiency of someone who had been moving through the world alone long enough to stop expecting that anyone else would need to know his reasons. Inez was in the side yard when he came back, hanging laundry on a line strung between 2 posts, and she had her sleeves rolled up past her elbows, and there was a wooden clothespin between her teeth, and she looked at him when he came through the gate with the expression of someone who cannot currently say hello because of the clothespin, but is acknowledging his presence with her eyes. "I need to measure your east window," he said. "The one in my room. I spoke to Mrs. Harrington about curtains." She took the clothespin out of her mouth. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he could not read. "You don't need to do that," she said. "You said you needed curtains, and it woke me up early this morning," he said. "I said I should get them made someday. Mrs. Harrington can have them done by tomorrow afternoon." Inez looked at him for another moment, and then she shook out the shirt she was holding and pinned it to the line and said, "There's a measuring tape on the shelf above the washstand. The window is 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall." He went upstairs and measured the window anyway, because she had told him the measurements in a way that meant she expected him to trust her, and he did trust her. But he wanted the excuse to stand in that small room for a moment with the sunlight coming through the east glass, and think about the fact that he had just spent $1.50 on curtains for a room he did not own, for a woman he had met 4 days ago, and that this seemed, at this moment in time, to be an entirely reasonable thing to have done. The window was indeed 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall. Saturday passed with a slow, full quality that Homer found himself leaning into without entirely meaning to. He repaired a broken hinge on the side gate that he had noticed was dragging, because he had the tools in his saddlebag, and it was bothering him. He helped Tomas Reyes move a load of hay bales from the supply wagon to the stable, because Tomas's usual helper had not shown up that morning, and Homer had nothing pressing to do until his Monday meeting with Fitch. He ate lunch, a remarkable green chili stew that Inez sent out to him in the yard with a biscuit on the side, and he sat on an overturned barrel and ate it in the sunshine and thought about Ohio, which he had not thought about in some years. His father had been a farmer who loved the land the way some men love a difficult thing, with loyalty that was not quite happiness, not quite contentment, but something deeper and more stubborn than either. Homer had spent his early years watching his father read that land like a language, knowing which field needed what, knowing where the water moved under the clay in dry years, knowing the names of things and the ways of things with an intimacy that Homer had always admired and always felt he did not quite share. He had thought when he left Ohio that the movement would eventually resolve into something, some place or some purpose that would feel the way his father's farm had felt to his father. It had not resolved. He had accumulated years and miles and a competent reputation among horse traders and cattle men and surveyors, and he had slept in more towns than he could name, and none of it had collected into the feeling he was after. He looked at the boarding house behind him, at the clean white walls and the good roof, and the window boxes where something green was beginning to grow in the spring warmth. He looked at the kitchen door through which Inez had emerged that morning with coffee, and a question about whether he preferred his stew with or without the dried red chili, which he did. He had said with, and she had nodded and gone back inside and returned 10 minutes later with a stew that tasted like something made by someone who understood that food was not just fuel, but was also, in the right hands, a form of generosity. He took the curtains to the east bedroom window that afternoon when Mrs. Harrington had them finished, and Inez came to the doorway of the room while he was hanging them on the rod he had fashioned from a length of straight iron he found in the barn, and she watched him do it with her arms folded and an expression that was not quite guarded but was thoughtful. "You're a man who fixes things," she said. "I notice things that need fixing," he said, which was slightly different. "My father was like that," she said. Then, as though this required explanation, "He built this whole place himself, him and 2 men from the Pueblo settlement south of here. It took 3 years and he did it right. He always said if something is worth doing, it's worth doing so that it lasts." Homer finished setting the rod in place and let the curtains fall into their natural hang. The linen was a soft blue-gray that caught the afternoon light pleasantly. "What happened to the 2 men from the Pueblo?" "Ramon still lives outside of town. He has a family and a good garden, and he comes by twice a year to help with whatever needs doing. The other man, his name was Eli. He died of fever in the winter of '74. She looked at the curtains. "Those are a good color." "Mrs. Harrington chose it," Homer said. "Mrs. Harrington has been telling me to get curtains for a year," Inez said. "I know perfectly well she chose the fabric to match that wall." She turned to go and then stopped in the doorway. "I appreciate it," she said, and her voice had the particular quality of someone saying a thing they mean rather than a thing that courtesy requires. "You're welcome," Homer said, and he meant that too. That evening at supper, with Delgado gone south toward the Rio Grande, and the young man with the bandaged hand replaced by 2 new guests, a Methodist minister passing through on his way to a congregation in Albuquerque, and a school teacher, A young woman named Florence Webb, who was 22 and had just been hired by the new territorial school board and was making her way to a posting in Silver City. The table had a different, livelier character. The minister, whose name was Reverend Caldwell, was a good-humored man who asked questions with genuine interest and told stories about his congregation in a way that made the people in them feel real. Florence Webb was sharp and funny and had opinions about everything, including the territorial government's approach to education, which she delivered with the confidence of someone who has recently read a great deal and is prepared to defend any of it. Homer found himself talking more at supper than he usually did. He told a story about a winter he had spent in Kansas helping a surveyor map a stretch of land along the Cimarron River, and he described the way the land looked under snow, the flat perfection of it, the silence, the way you could see a man coming from 3 miles away because there was nothing to hide behind. And Florence asked him questions and the Reverend asked questions. And Inez, who had joined the table for the last part of the meal as she usually did, listened with the particular quality of attention of someone who is interested, but not performing interest. When the others had gone up to their rooms and Homer was helping carry plates to the kitchen, which he had begun doing 3 days ago without anyone suggesting it, Inez said, "You've been a lot of places." "I have," he said. She was filling the wash basin with water from the pump inside the kitchen, the old pump, the one that needed replacing, that made a laboring sound like a man clearing his throat. "Does it suit you? The moving?" He thought about this for a moment honestly. "It used to suit me better than the alternative," he said. She handed him a cloth and he dried the plates she washed and set them on the shelf in the order they lived there, which he had learned by watching. "And now," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Now I'm not sure what the alternative is," he said. "I've been moving long enough that I'm not sure I know what I'd be doing if I stopped." She handed him a plate. "Working, most likely," she said, but she said it gently, in the tone of someone who is not dismissing the thing you said but is gently pointing toward something practical. "Everybody works. The question is just whether the work is in a place that matters to you." He dried the plate and set it on the shelf. "Does this place matter to you? Redemption Flats?" "My father built this house in Redemption Flats," she said. "My mother is buried 2 miles south of here on the ridge above the creek. Yes, it matters to me." She handed him the last cup. "It does not have to matter to anyone else in the same way. That is the thing about a place mattering to you. You cannot transfer the feeling. You can only have it yourself." He set the cup on the shelf and thought about Ohio. Monday morning, Garland Fitch paid him. Not the full amount. He was $80 short of what he claimed for the horses and $30 short of the Cimarron debt, and he explained this with elaborate regret and a promise that the remainder would be coming within the month when certain ranchers paid their accounts. Homer looked at the man for a long moment, and then he took what was on the table and said he would be back for the rest. "You mean you'll send someone?" Fitch said. "I mean I'll come back," Homer said. He walked to the livery and told Tomas that the quarter horses were staying another few weeks, and could they remain in the stable at the current board rate. Tomas said yes without surprise, which told Homer that Tomas had expected something like this. "Fitch never pays full on the first pass," Tomas said, handing a carrot to the bay, who received it with dignified gratitude. "Second or third usually." "Second for me," Homer said. "You staying at the Mercer house?" Tomas said. "For the time being," Homer said. Tomas looked at him with the same careful, assessing eyes he had used on the first day. "She runs a good house," he said. "Her father was a good man. Town be worse off without it." Homer nodded. "She doesn't have much help," Tomas said. "Just the girl who comes for the laundry and Ramon from the Pueblo when there's heavy work. Since her father passed, she's been doing most of it herself." Homer had not asked about this. He understood that Tomas was telling him not for any particular purpose, but simply because it was a true thing, and Tomas was the kind of man who said true things when they seemed relevant. He paid for another week at the boarding house that evening, which brought him through the following Sunday, and Inez wrote the receipt in her clean, precise hand without comment, though there was a quality to her silence that felt neither disapproving nor encouraging but simply present, in the way that she herself was always present, fully, without performance, just being exactly where she was. The next several days developed their own texture. Homer was not someone who had spent much time in one town in recent years without a specific task anchoring him to it, and he discovered that Redemption Flats, when you were not rushing through it toward the next thing, had the quality of a place that rewarded attention. He learned the rhythms of the main street, which businesses opened early and which late, who visited whom and in what order, where the water came from a deep well at the north end of town, supplemented in the rainy season by a cistern behind the church. What the land looked like 3 miles east when you rode out in the early morning, which he did twice that week, because the mesa turned a color in the first light that was unlike anything he had seen in Colorado or Kansas or anywhere else he had been. A deep oxidized red with thin lines of yellow running through it like something left behind by a process too large and too old to entirely comprehend. He had not had occasion to think about beauty very much in recent years, not because he was insensible to it, but because beauty requires a kind of stillness to fully register, and he had not been still. He was becoming still. He was also finding excuses to be in the kitchen or the yard or the side porch in the hours when Inez was working, which he told himself was because there was always something useful to be done. And he was not wrong. There was always something useful to be done, because Inez was running a boarding house with limited help and a to-do list that grew faster than she could address it. He replaced 2 broken boards on the side porch. He repaired the old water pump with a new washer and seal that he ordered from Mrs. Harrington's dry goods store, which delayed the need for the full iron replacement by at least another season. He helped Florence Webb, who turned out to be staying a full week before her transport to Silver City arrived, carry boxes of school books from the supply wagon to her room, and in exchange, Florence told him things about Redemption Flats that only a person with sharp eyes and no existing social obligations would notice, which was useful. "She's been here 4 years by herself," Florence said in a quiet voice in the hallway outside the upstairs rooms, nodding toward the kitchen below where they could hear Inez working. "The town respects her, but respect is not the same as company." "I know the difference," Homer said. "I'm sure you do," Florence said and went into her room. On the Thursday of his second week, Homer was in the side yard splitting a cord of wood that he had noticed was getting low, because the evenings in late spring could still turn cold, and the kitchen stove needed regular feeding, when Inez came out with 2 mugs of coffee and sat on the step of the side porch and said, "You don't have to do that." "I know," he said, and set the next log on the block. She watched him for a while, not uncomfortably, cradling her coffee mug in both hands. He liked the way she watched things without commentary, without the need to fill the silence, just watching and thinking her own thoughts alongside his. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes," he said. "When you said you'd be here 1 week," she said, "did you mean that? Or was that just a thing you say when you come to a new place?" He set the axe down and turned to look at her. She was looking at him directly, without the guarded quality he sometimes saw in people asking a question that matters to them. She was asking because she wanted to know, and she was asking without defensiveness. "I meant it," he said, and then something changed. "Fitch didn't pay you," she said. "That was part of it," he said. She waited. She was very good at waiting. "I like it here," he said, which was the most honest reduction of the thing he had been trying not to quite say for several days. "I like Redemption Flats, I like the country, I like the people." He paused. "I like the boarding house." Inez looked at him for a long moment, and then she looked down at her coffee. "Liking a place is a good reason to stay," she said, "if a person has no pressing reason to leave." "I have no pressing reason to leave," he said. "Then stay," she said simply. She did not make it complicated. She said it the same way she said everything, directly, without performance, as though the thing were obvious and she was merely pointing at it. He picked up the axe and went back to splitting wood, and inside him something that had been in motion for 12 years settled an inch or two toward the ground, which was not nothing. That evening, the Reverend Caldwell had gone on to Albuquerque, and Florence was leaving in the morning. And it was just Homer and an older rancher who was passing through and barely spoke. And Inez came to the table and stayed for the whole supper rather than just the last half. She told a story about the first summer after her father died, when she had tried to make the boarding house work on her own and had nearly lost it twice, once to a bad season of guests and once to a leak in the roof that had cost 3 months' savings to fix. She told it without self-pity, the way a person tells a story about a hard thing they got through, with the mild wonder of someone who sometimes still surprises themselves with the fact of having managed. Homer listened and asked questions, and found himself thinking that the kind of courage it took to do what she had done, to hold a place together alone, in a territorial town without family nearby, on her own work and her own judgment, was a kind of courage he had been adjacent to all his life, in other people's stories, but had never had occasion to sit across a table from. Florence Webb left on Friday morning with 2 boxes of books, a borrowed blanket for the journey, and a look she gave Homer on her way out the door that said, fairly clearly and without words, that she knew exactly what was happening in this house and expected him not to waste it. He told himself he was not going to rush anything. He had been moving for 12 years and he had arrived somewhere that he did not want to leave, and the worst thing he could do was handle it with the speed of a man who had too much practice at passing through and not enough at being somewhere. So he was careful. He was present. He helped with things that needed helping with, and he had supper every evening, and he had coffee every morning. And he talked with Inez about everything about the land, about the territorial government, about the price of goods and the character of towns, and the history of this particular corner of New Mexico, which she knew as thoroughly as anyone who had grown up in it. He learned that she had been educated at a mission school in Santa Fe for 3 years before her mother died and she came home, and that she read everything she could get, and that she had opinions about the Compromise of 1877 and the continued displacement of the Apache people and the railroad, and what it was doing to the territory that were held with the same directness and force as everything else about her. He told her about Ohio, which he had not told anyone about in years. He told her about his father and the farm, and the way the light came across the corn in July, and how after the bank took it, there was a period of about 6 months when he had felt like a person with no right to want anything, because wanting things was what had gotten them into trouble. She listened to this, all of it, without pity, but with the particular attention of someone who is placing a thing carefully in their understanding of you, making room for it. "You have been angry at yourself for a long time," she said, one evening on the side porch after supper, when the sky was going orange over the mesa and the air smelled of warm dust and the sage that grew along the south side of the yard. "I don't think I'm angry," he said. "Not angry like a fire," she said. "Angry like a door you haven't opened because you decided a long time ago that there was nothing worth opening it for." He thought about this. "That's a very specific description." "I'm a specific person," she said, and there was the almost smile again. "I think," he said slowly, "that the door is open." She looked at him. The sky behind her was extraordinary. "When did it open?" She said, "Second morning," he said. "You said good morning and handed me buckwheat flapjacks." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I remember that morning." "You gave a full report on the buckwheat flour from Santa Fe," he said. "I had been waiting for it for 2 weeks," she said, in the tone of someone defending a perfectly reasonable thing. "I know," he said. "That's the part that did it." She looked at him for a moment that was longer than necessary for simple conversation, and then she looked back at the sky, and there was a quality to her looking that was different from her usual way of looking at things. Softer, maybe, more inward. He did not say anything else that evening. He did not need to. There are conversations that do their work in the space between the words, and that was one of them. He went to see Fitch on the following Monday with the methodical patience of a man who now had an interest in the outcome that went beyond the money. He also had, in his coat pocket, a letter from a territorial land agent in Santa Fe that Reverend Caldwell had mentioned in passing before leaving, which outlined a new process by which individuals could file for territorial land grants in the area. And one of the conditions of this new process was that the agent would be sending a representative through all the major territorial towns to advise residents on their options. Homer had written to the land agent asking for more information, and the reply had come that week, and it told him several things he found interesting. He told Fitch, pleasantly but with the clarity of someone who is not going to be moved this time, that the quarter-horse deal needed to close by end of week, or he would accept the Tucson buyer's standing offer, and that the remainder of the Cimarron debt needed to be settled in full by the same date, or he was prepared to take it to the circuit court at the next session, which was 4 weeks away, and which the land agent's representative, who was coming through Redemption Flats in 2 weeks, would be in a position to advise on the legal avenue if Fitch required confirmation of this. The mention of the land agent's representative was mostly bluster, but it had the desired effect. Fitch paid in full by Wednesday. Homer walked out of Fitch's office with more money than he had walked in with, which was how these things were supposed to go and rarely did, and he stood on the boardwalk outside in the afternoon sun feeling the lightness of a resolved thing. He went to the livery and told Tomas he was selling the quarter horses, and Tomas, who apparently had a buyer already in mind, arranged the introduction before end of day, and Homer sold both horses for a better price than he had originally hoped for, and came back to the boarding house that evening with more money than he had arrived with and no scheduled departure. He stood at the kitchen door and knocked, because Inez was working inside and he did not want to walk in without announcement. She came to the door with flour on her hands and asked what he needed, and he said he needed to talk to her about something when she had a moment, and she looked at him carefully and said she would have a moment after supper. After supper, in the side yard with the spring night warm around them and the stars very clear overhead, the way stars are in the New Mexico territory when there is no moon and the air is dry, Homer told Inez that he had finished his business with Fitch and that there was nothing keeping him in Redemption Flats any longer except his own preferences, and that his preference was to stay. She was quiet for a long time. "I don't want to cause confusion about my intentions," he said. "What are your intentions?" She said, "They are longer term than a boarding house," he said. She looked at the stars. "Longer term how?" "I came here meaning to stay 1 week," he said. "I have now been here 3. I have repaired your gate hinge and your pump and 2 boards on your side porch and hung curtains in your east bedroom. I have eaten more good food at your table than I have eaten in the previous 5 years combined. I have had more worthwhile conversations in 3 weeks than I had in the 3 years before that. I am 31 years old and I have been moving since I was 19, and I have not, until this town, found a place that made me want to stop. I would very much like to stop here." Inez was quiet. He could not see her expression in the dark, only the profile of her face against the stars, which was a very good profile. "And me?" she said. "Especially you," he said. She looked at him then. "I have been running this house alone for 4 years," she said. "I am not looking for someone to manage things for me. I manage things." "I know," he said. "I'm not offering to manage things. I'm offering to be here." "That is a meaningful distinction," she said. "I hope so," he said. She was quiet again. He waited because he had learned that her silences were working silences. She was thinking, not retreating, and the thinking deserved time. "I would need to know you better," she said finally. "Not better than I know you now. I know you well enough to know you are a man who means what he says. But I would need to know that this is not a feeling that the spring and the territory and a certain restlessness at 31 is producing in a man who will feel differently at 31 and a half. "That's fair," he said. "Ask me again in another month," she said. "Stay the month, be useful or idle as suits you, and ask me again." "And if you say yes," he said. "Then we will figure out what that means," she said, with the matter-of-fact quality of someone who does not see the need to borrow complexity from the future. "And if you say no," he said. She looked at him, and this time he could see her expression because a cloud had shifted and let through a little more starlight, and her expression was the almost smile again, except it was less almost than usual. "Ask me at the end of the month," she said, "and we'll see." He did stay the month. He stayed it fully and without the sense of provisionally camping out that had characterized every other place he had ever been. He wrote to his brother in Michigan for the first time in 3 years, a letter that was frank about where he was and what he thought was happening, and his brother wrote back within 2 weeks, which was fast for a man in Michigan, with a letter that said he was glad Homer had finally come to his senses and that their mother was well, and that the news from Ohio was quiet. He wrote to the land agent in Santa Fe and received a detailed reply about the mechanics of filing for a territorial plot adjacent to Redemption Flats, which he was beginning to think about with a concreteness he had not previously applied to the idea of owning land. He talked with Ramon, the man from the Pueblo who came twice a year to help Inez with heavy work, and who arrived during Homer's 4th week to do some drainage work on the east side of the building. Ramon was a man of about 55 with quiet authority and a gift for assessing situations accurately. And over 2 days of working alongside each other, they established a mutual respect that had very little to do with words and a great deal to do with the shared understanding of men who know how to work. On the last day of Ramon's visit, over a dinner that Inez made with particular care because she always cooked better when people she cared about were at the table, Ramon said, addressing no one in particular, "This house has been needing a second pair of hands for some years." "I manage," Inez said. "You manage excellently," Ramon said. "That is not the same thing as not needing." Homer looked at his plate. "The pump is working better," Ramon added, and it was not clear whether he was talking about the pump. The month ended on a Sunday evening. Homer had been counting the days for the last week, not with impatience but with the attentive focus of a man who knows something important is coming and wants to be present for it. He had done his thinking. He had examined his feelings from multiple angles, the way you examine a piece of country from different elevations to make sure you understand its actual character, and he had arrived at the conclusion that nothing he felt was provisional, restless, or spring-induced. It was the most rooted thing he had ever felt. He found Inez after supper on the side porch, which had become, over the course of the month, their natural place for the conversations that mattered. The evening was warm and sweet-smelling with a breeze coming off the mesa, and the sky was the particular clear dark of a New Mexico spring night. "It's been a month," he said. "I know," she said. "I told you I'd ask you again," he said. "You did," she said. He turned to look at her. She was looking at him already. He had noticed, been looking at him for some time before he turned, with the direct, unguarded quality that had been one of the first things he had noticed about her and continued to be, in his estimation, one of the most remarkable things about anyone he had ever met. She did not look around things. She looked at them. "Inez Mercer," he said. "I rode into Redemption Flats on a Tuesday in April meaning to stay 1 week, sell 2 horses, and collect a debt. I have now been here 7 weeks and I have no intention of leaving, and the only reason I am still technically a guest in your house is that I want to ask your permission to be something other than a guest, and I want to ask it properly." She was quiet. He continued. "I don't have a great deal to offer in the way of property," he said. "I have a good horse and a respectable amount of cash money and skills that are useful. I am looking into land. I intend to stay in this territory. I intend, if you will have me, to spend the rest of my life in a way that makes sense to you and to me both, in a place that matters, with a person who makes me want to stop moving." He paused. "I am asking you to let me court you properly, with the understanding that my intentions are marriage when you are ready and if you choose it." The breeze moved through the yard. Somewhere in the distance a dog was barking at something. "You have very good penmanship," Inez said. He blinked. "I'm sorry." "Your handwriting," she said. "When you wrote the note about the pump parts, you had very good handwriting. I noticed it and thought it was unusual for a man who spent most of his time in saddles and livery stables." "My mother was a school teacher," he said after a moment. "I know," she said. "You told me that, in the second week." She looked at him with the full force of those direct eyes. "Homer Bancroft, I have been watching you for 7 weeks. I watched you repair things no one asked you to repair. I watched you be kind to Florence and respectful to Reverend Caldwell, and honest with Ramon and patient with Fitch when patience was warranted and firm when it was not. I watched you learn the way I take my coffee and where the plates go on the shelf and which step on the stairs creaks and how I prefer the gate latch. I have been waiting a month for you to say the thing you just said." He looked at her. "You've been waiting a month, 3 weeks and 4 days to be exact," she said, "since the evening you told me the door was open." He almost laughed. "And you made me wait." "I had to be sure it was not the spring," she said with perfect composure. "And," he said. "It is not the spring," she said. He took her hand, which she permitted with the calm of someone who has considered the gesture in advance and finds it acceptable, and then she turned her hand over and held his, and they sat on the side porch while the New Mexico night deepened around them, and it was one of the finest evenings of Homer Bancroft's life, and he had had some fine evenings. What followed was a courtship conducted with a decorum appropriate to a woman who ran a public boarding house and had a reputation in the community that she valued, and with an earnestness on Homer's part that sometimes surprised him with its own depth. They took rides together on Sunday afternoons, up to the mesa and along the creek, and Inez showed him the ridge above the creek where her mother was buried, a small flat stone with a good carving of a bird on it that her father had placed himself, and Homer stood there with his hat in his hands and said nothing, which was the right thing. He filed for a land claim on a 20-acre plot half a mile north of the boarding house, an open piece of country with good grass and a spring-fed seep that Tomas Reyes had told him about, and the land agent's representative, who did indeed come through Redemption Flats in late June, told him the claim was solid and the spring was a genuine asset. Homer began making plans. He was, it turned out, not bad at plans when he had a reason to keep them. He proposed to Inez formally on an evening in late July, in the side yard under the stars, with a ring he had ordered through Mrs. Harrington from a jeweler in Santa Fe. A simple silver band with a small turquoise stone that was, as he told Inez, chosen because turquoise was the color of the sky in this territory at the hour just after the sun went down, which was the hour he had first understood that he was not leaving. She said yes. She said it the same way she said everything, directly, without excess, with the quality of a woman who has considered a thing fully and arrived at her answer from a place of conviction rather than impulse. They were married in October, in the whitewashed church at the far end of the main street, on a morning that was cool and brilliant, with the mesa throwing its purple shadow westward and the cottonwood trees along the creek in their October gold. Tomas Reyes was there, and Ramon from the Pueblo, and Mrs. Harrington, and most of Redemption Flats, because a town of that size does not have many occasions for celebration and treats the ones it has with appropriate enthusiasm. The minister who performed the ceremony was a visiting Presbyterian pastor who had been through once before and had, by coincidence, been given the room with the blue-gray curtains. Inez wore a dress of cream-colored wool that she had made herself, with small buttons at the wrist and a collar that her mother had embroidered years ago, and she had kept in a cedar box since her mother's death. Homer wore his best coat, which he had had cleaned and pressed at the barber's shop, and his hair was combed, and he stood at the front of the church with the particular stillness of a man who has arrived somewhere after a very long journey and knows it. When Inez walked up the aisle on Ramon's arm, she had asked him quietly some weeks before, and he had accepted with a gravity and warmth that said everything about the esteem in which he held her. Homer looked at her and thought about the morning in April when she had come through the kitchen door with a platter of biscuits and said good morning without looking up, and how in the space of that ordinary small moment something had begun that had led to this entirely extraordinary one. They stood together before the pastor and they made their promises to each other, and Inez made hers with the same directness she brought to everything, looking at Homer without deflection, and Homer made his with the steadiness of a man who has found the thing he was looking for and intends to hold it carefully. The town fed them afterward. Mrs. Harrington brought a cake. Tomas Reyes brought a bottle of excellent whiskey that he shared judiciously. Ramon brought food from his family's kitchen that was so good it was discussed for several years after in connection with that day. Florence Webb, who had been informed by letter and had written back from Silver City with warm congratulations and a small package containing 2 good books, was not there but was thought of. Homer and Inez Bancroft. It had a settled sound, like something that had found its right place. They continued to run the boarding house together, which was not the original shape Homer had imagined for his life, but turned out to be exactly right, because he was good at the parts of it that had always exhausted Inez: the heavy work, the maintenance, the negotiations with suppliers, the occasional difficult guest who needed a firm and patient hand, and she was good at the parts that were beyond him, which was essentially the entire enterprise of making a place feel like somewhere a person wanted to be. Together, they made it better than it had been, which neither of them said out loud but both of them knew. Homer's land claim north of town became a small ranch, modest by any reasonable measure but solid. He raised 3 horses in the first year, added a small number of cattle the second, and by the third year had a working arrangement with 2 of the local ranchers that kept the operation viable without requiring him to be absent from the boarding house for more than 2 or 3 days at a time. He had discovered that he liked ranching the way his father had liked farming, not with the uncomplicated joy of a man who has never done anything else, but with the deep, considered satisfaction of someone who has tried enough other things to know what actual rightness feels like. Their first child was born in the 2nd year of their marriage, a boy they named James, after Homer's father, and the morning after James was born Homer sat in the chair beside Inez's bed with the baby in his arms and looked out the east-facing window, through the blue-gray curtains, at the morning light coming across the mesa, and felt something so large and quiet that he did not try to name it. Inez watched him from the bed with tired, clear eyes, and after a long while she said, "You look like a man who has figured something out." "I think I have," he said. "What is it?" she said. "The alternative," he said. She waited. "You asked me once whether the moving suited me, and I said it used to suit me better than the alternative. You asked what the alternative was, and I said I didn't know." He looked at James, who was asleep in the total, unconditional way of the very newly born. "I know now." Inez smiled, the full version this time, not the almost smile but the real one that she reserved for moments of actual happiness, and Homer thought for the 100th time that it was the best thing he had ever seen. James was 2 years old when Inez's second pregnancy brought them a daughter, Clara, who arrived in November with considerable noise and opinion, which Inez said was to be expected from a November baby and Homer said was to be expected from a child of hers. Clara was the loudest and most determined person in the boarding house from approximately the first week, which was saying something given that boarding houses attract a range of characters. The boarding house grew. Not dramatically. Redemption Flats was not a city and did not become one, but steadily. As the territory developed and the railroad crept closer and more people came through, and some of them stayed. Homer added 2 rooms to the back of the building in the 3rd year, a project he and Ramon undertook together over the course of a long spring, and the result was solid and right in the way that Ramon said Inez's father would have approved of, which was the highest compliment available. Delgado came back through twice, on his way between places in the unhurried way that was his, and both times he ate at the table and both times he looked at Homer with the private expression of a man whose early observations have been entirely confirmed. And once, only once, he said, "The buckwheat flapjacks are still good." And Homer said, "Yes, they are." And that was the end of that conversation, but it contained everything. Garland Fitch left Redemption Flats in the autumn of the second year, under circumstances that involved some complicated dealings with the Territorial Land Office that Homer had no direct involvement in, but observed without regret. His departure was noted in the town, and then the town moved on, which was what towns did, and the building above the Mercantile was taken over by a young attorney from Albuquerque who turned out to be a reasonable addition to the community. Mrs. Harrington's dry goods store was there for all of it, and Mrs. Harrington continued to notice everything and say the important portions of it aloud and keep the rest to herself in a proportion that demonstrated lifelong wisdom. She was one of Inez's closest friends, and on Sunday afternoons when the boarding house was quiet they would sometimes sit on the side porch together and talk, and Homer would pass through and make coffee and bring it out without being asked, because after a time he knew everything about the rhythms of that house and everyone in it. Knew when coffee was wanted and when silence was wanted and when company was wanted, and when the best thing he could do was take the children to the creek and let the side porch have its afternoon. James started school at 6, at the new territorial school that had been fully established by then, and came home full of questions that Homer answered as honestly and completely as he could, the way his mother had answered his questions when he was young, and Inez helped him with his reading in the evenings at the kitchen table, and Clara sat beside them demanding equal time before she was old enough to need it. The spring of 1885, 7 years after Homer Bancroft had ridden into Redemption Flats on a Tuesday with $37 and 2 horses to sell, he stood at the window of the east bedroom, his bedroom now theirs. The curtains replaced twice since the first pair he had hung, but always in the same blue-gray color, because Inez had said they were right and saw no reason to change a right thing, and watched the sun come up over the mesa, and listened to the sounds of his house waking. Below him in the kitchen, Inez was already awake, because she was always awake before him and probably always would be, which he had accepted and in fact loved because it meant that every morning when he came downstairs, there was coffee made and a woman who looked up from whatever she was doing and said good morning in the voice that had undone him at 31 and that still, at 38, had the same effect, which he considered a remarkable piece of luck. James was 8 and growing fast, with his mother's eyes and his father's way of noticing things that needed fixing. Clara was 6 and had, if anything, more opinions than she'd had at birth, and was currently of the view that the family required a dog, a position she had been advancing for several months with the methodical persistence of someone who understood that the proper response to a no was a better argument. There was a third baby coming. Inez had told him in the quiet of a February evening, sitting on the side porch in the cold with a blanket around her shoulders because she had said she needed the air, and he had sat beside her with his arm around her and felt the same large quiet thing he had felt the morning James was born, the same thing he had no name for and did not need one. "Boy or girl, what do you think?" he had said. "I have no opinion," Inez had said. "A healthy baby is the only thing I am asking for." "A healthy baby," he agreed. "And possibly a dog," she added, which was the first and only time she had sided with Clara on the subject. He had laughed and she had laughed, and the cold February air had carried it up into the dark above the side porch, and the mesa had stood silent and enormous to the north, and the whole of Redemption Flats had been quiet around them, just the two of them on the porch with a blanket and a piece of good news, and 7 years of a life built together bone by bone and brick by brick and morning by morning. He went downstairs on that spring morning in 1885, and the kitchen was warm and smelled of coffee and something baking, and Inez was at the stove with her back to him, and she heard the creak of the third step from the bottom, which was the step that had always creaked and would probably always creak, and she said, without turning, "Good morning. Coffee's ready." "Good morning," he said, and poured himself a cup, and sat down at the kitchen table, and watched the woman he loved move with comfortable efficiency through the kitchen she had been running since before he arrived, and thought about how a man could ride into a place meaning to stay 1 week and end up staying the rest of his life, and how the pivot point, if you traced it back carefully, was not the horses or the debt or the land or the plans or any of the 10,000 practical things that had accreted around it. It was a second morning in April, and a woman who came through a door with biscuits and said good morning without looking up, and a man who heard his own name in that ordinary greeting and forgot entirely to count the days. "What are you thinking about?" Inez said, turning from the stove with a look that was both curious and fond, the way she looked at him when she suspected he was having one of his quiet internal conversations. "Ohio," he said. "Ohio," she repeated, mildly skeptical. "The way good things start small," he said. "The way you can have the whole of something in the smallest moment of it if you're paying attention." She considered this, turning it over in the way she turned things over with the particular attention of someone who takes ideas seriously. "What was the small moment?" she said. "Second morning," he said. "You said good morning." She smiled, the real one. "I say good morning every morning." "I know," he said. "I have been counting them." She came to the table with the coffee pot and refilled his cup and stood there for a moment looking at him with those direct eyes that saw everything and hid nothing, and then she leaned down and kissed him on the side of his head in the easy, certain way of a person who is exactly where they intend to be, and she went back to the stove. The sun was moving up behind the mesa. The boarding house was beginning to stir around them. A door upstairs, footsteps, the particular sound of James deciding not to get out of bed quite, yet that both of them recognized without needing to acknowledge. Clara would be up within the hour with her full morning energy and her ongoing advocacy for the dog. There would be guests at breakfast and a supply order to place, and the East Field fence that needed looking at, and a letter to write to the land agent about the water rights that Ramon had flagged as something requiring attention. There was a whole day in front of them, full of ordinary things, and all of it was exactly right. Homer Bancroft drank his coffee and listened to his house, and looked at his wife at the stove and thought about the word home, about how he had been looking for it since he was 19, moving through the West from one provisional camp to the next, certain in some inarticulate way that it existed, but unable to locate it by the methods he was using. He had been looking for it in geography, in purpose, in work, in motion, in the accumulation of miles and skills and useful reputation. He had been looking in entirely the wrong directions, which was something a man could only know from the other side of finding it. It was not a place, or not only a place. It was the specific combination of a place and a person, and a life built together through the ordinary daily labor of showing up and being honest and fixing the things that needed fixing and saying good morning and meaning it. It was Redemption Flats and the Mesa and the blue-gray curtains and the best scrambled eggs in the New Mexico territory, and a woman with flour on her hands and eyes that looked directly at the world and found it worth looking at. He had ridden in meaning to stay 1 week. He was going to stay until the end. The baby was born that autumn, another boy, healthy and loud and immediately at home in the world, and Inez held him against her chest in the soft afternoon light of the room, where the blue-gray curtains moved gently in the October air. And Homer sat beside her and they looked at this new person together with the quiet wonder that does not diminish no matter how many times it comes. And after a while Inez said, "What should we call him?" Homer thought about it. He thought about Ohio and his father, already honored in James. He thought about Ramon, already 60, still coming twice a year with the faithfulness of someone who loved this place and the people in it. He thought about Delgado passing through, and Tomas Reyes and his careful eyes, and Mrs. Harrington and her excellent instincts, and Reverend Caldwell and Florence Webb and everyone who had sat at the long table in the dining room of Mercer's boarding house over the years and been fed and housed and sent on their way, or in the case of one particular horse trader from Ohio, kept. "William," he said, "after your father." Inez looked at him. Her eyes were bright. "You remembered his name," she said. "You told me once," he said, "first week." She looked down at the baby. "William," she said, trying it. The baby, as if in opinion, made a satisfied sound. "William Bancroft." "William Bancroft," Homer agreed. Outside in the yard, they could hear James chasing Clara in the last of the afternoon sun, and the sound of a dog barking, because Clara's campaign had finally succeeded in March with the arrival of a three-legged shepherd dog named Biscuit, a name that had been Clara's insistence, and that Homer had accepted with a feeling that was at least 40% directed at Inez and the buckwheat flapjacks of 7 years ago. The mesa threw its purple shadow across the town. The boarding house stood solid and well-maintained at the corner of the main street, white walls and good roof and window boxes in full autumn growth, the sign above the door reading Bancroft's boarding house and meals, clean rooms, fair prices, breakfast at 7, which was the same sign as before except for the name, and the name was right. Homer Bancroft had ridden into the territory meaning to stay 1 week. She had said good morning on the second day, and he had lost count. And in losing count he had found everything he had been riding toward for 12 years without knowing exactly what it was. The east window in the room upstairs had blue-gray curtains and let in the morning light, and every morning the morning light came in, and every morning there was coffee and there was Inez, and there was the life they had built together out of the good material of ordinary days, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the whole of everything.